Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ukraine, a country divided. Its government's decision not to pursue integration with the European Union and opt for Russia instead has Western politicians and media in an uproar. Brussels feels snubbed, while Moscow has a wait-and-see approach as Ukrainian politics is anything but stable. The so-called struggle for Ukraine is far from over. To CrossTalk Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest Lilith Gevorgyan in London. She is a senior economist at IHS Global Insight. In Paris, we have John Laughlin. He is the director of studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. And in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sloboda. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. All right, folks, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. John, if I can go to you first, all this media coverage of this for the past week, it's the tussle between the European Union and Russia for control of Ukraine. It's put very much in Cold War terms here, but very few people want to focus on the real deep troubles that are occurring in Ukraine and how Ukraine is trying to get itself out of a really nasty fix. I want to point out to our viewers here that the IMF is knocking on the door. If they don't do certain things, they're not going to get any more money. There's hardly any money left in the bank, and they have a lot of foreign debts to pay in the first quarter of next year. It's dire straits in Ukraine, and Brussels is blaming Moscow. Go ahead, John.
I think you've put the question, Peter, in exactly the right way. This whole issue is being talked about in Cold War terms, but in fact, Ukraine's real interests are being completely neglected. I've had occasion to say this now on several other interviews. People have asked me whether Ukraine has an interest in joining the EU, and my reply has always been that from the EU's point of view, the only interest is in the geopolitical defeat that Ukrainian signature would inflict on Russia. In other words, the EU does not have Ukraine's interests at heart. What it has at heart is a geopolitical program of ideological and geopolitical strengthening of its own institutions and enlargement, of course, of its own writ, deep into the heart of historic Russia. Ukraine is not, the interests of Ukrainians are not what the European Union is interested in this. And that is why, of course, the Ukrainian government hasn't signed. Because, quite simply, they've seen the writing on the wall. They know that they're running out of money. They know that, as President Yanukovych said, all that they get from Europe is nice words. And they've realized that if they had signed the association agreement, it would have been, to paraphrase a British politician, the longest suicide note in history.
Okay. Lilith, I mean, if we look at what the European Union was offering and what the Russians supposedly are offering with customs, okay, because Ukraine is being given a choice here, and both Russia and the European Union would like integration with Ukraine. But Yanukovych, at the end of the day, just said it's not a good enough deal. I mean, irrespective of one's opinion of Yanukovych, he didn't like the deal because he's thinking about his political future.
Well, I agree with you. Definitely, he had a number of reasons behind his decision, and one of them was his political survival. The early 2015 presidential elections are coming up, and the president is quite keen to get the economic deal that will help him to get re-elected. I have to say I disagree with John saying about EU's intentions when it comes to Ukraine, and that it doesn't really fit with the country's interest. It does fit with Ukraine's long-term economic interest. If Ukraine is seeking economic convergence with European Union, they cannot really avoid the association agreement and what it involves. But at the same time, in the short term, it appears that the Russian deal, whatever it is, because we don't really have the details, is probably more suitable for the economic and political needs of the current Ukrainian government.
Okay, we'll talk about the future and this point exactly a little bit later. Mark, if I can go to you, I want to ask you a question that nobody in Western media wants to touch, really, because it doesn't suit their agenda. But the Party of Regions at the end of the summer, all the way to the present, was pushing for this to happen. This is Yanukovych's party, and almost no one wants to say, well, the Party of Regions is run by a group of oligarchs that don't want to reform the economy, and they just want to get in bed with the EU so they can clean their money and clean up their reputations, because they're not so interested in integrating with Russia as well. Another note you never really come across in Western media. Go ahead, Mark.
I think, John, perhaps you've put it better than I could myself. Yanukovych's Party of Regions has often been characterized in the Western media as a pro-Russia party, which Russia could only hope and wish that they were. They aren't at all. They are a party that represents the interests of a Russian-speaking Eastern and Southern demographic, but even more particularly a group of elite oligarchs out of the Donbass industrial region. And the principal interests of these oligarchs is integration with the European Union on conditions that will allow them to legitimize and probably abscond with a great deal of what wealth they have acquired to London or one of the other European financial centers. And in pursuit of this, the Party of Regions has actually been waging an amazing state television propaganda campaign for the past half a year in support of the EU association agreement. And this has, within the last few months, helped swing public opinion so that there is a slim majority now in favor of, well, it's falsely phrased as joining the European Union, which the European Association Agreement is far from, vice joining the customs union.
John, can you tell our viewers what the European Union was actually offering Ukraine? If I remember correctly, 1.6 billion euros over a 7-year period, only if the IMF agrees to previous agreements with Ukraine. I mean, again, you don't have to be Yanukovych or Yushchenko or even Mickey Mouse in Kiev to say, hey, that's a great deal, because it's not.
That's right, and the fact is the European Union doesn't have money to hand out. Ukraine needs an awful lot of money, and everyone knows that the European Union and its member states are broke. They have debt up to their eyeballs, and they can't afford to pay their own bills, let alone other people's. But you asked me, what is the European Union offering? It's a very good question and a very important one, because people, as you say in the media, have presented Ukraine's choice as between East and West, as if Ukraine was a donkey between two equal bales of hay. The fact is that the agreement that the European Union is proposing, and that's why I called it geopolitical earlier, is of a radically different nature from anything that Ukraine might potentially sign with Russia and other ex-Soviet states. On the European side, you have an association agreement, which is basically a political agreement. The economic aspect of it is more or less negligible. It's about reforming the political system, reforming the judiciary, reforming the energy sector, reforming everything in order to make it Euro-compatible and in order to get Ukraine politically, and also economically, but politically into the European orbit. On the other hand, the customs union, assuming Ukraine were to sign it, which of course is an assumption, is a much more flexible structure. It does not involve anything like the amount of political engagements and ideological engagements which the European Union demands. So we're dealing with two radically different projects here.
Can you speak to that? Because it is very different here, because Russia is not looking to reform Ukraine, I mean, only under the terms of having good business relations. But the European agenda is very much different. And we all know on this program that Ukraine is in dire, dire straits. It needs money. It needs a rescue package, not, I mean, great. I think the judicial system should be reformed, but that's not their top priority at the moment, is it?
Well, no, that's exactly what I was saying previously, that you have short-term goals and long-term goals, and they're not necessarily compatible at the moment. In the short term, as you said, Ukraine really needs liquidity, external liquidity. Indeed, the European Union cannot really provide all the financial needs for Ukraine's financial needs. It really needs IMF. But going back to your second point as to what EU is really offering to Ukraine, yes, it is a political commitment and an economic commitment. It's a long-term choice. It cannot really be imposed on Ukraine. The association agreement doesn't really have the capacity to impose on the country to choose policies that are long-term, potentially not very popular in the beginning, that will reform the judiciary, that will eventually reform the business environment. The free trade agreement is actually quite beneficial, and that is why some of the large businesses that you've mentioned earlier have been quite inclined to pursue the association agreement, because it will increase their market possibilities, unlike pursuing what Russia is offering in the form of customs union, which really has to lift off yet.
You know, Mark, I mean, a cynic would say is that the EU, in considering its economic situation, is interested in Ukraine for like cheap labor and to export goods to a large market. And you know, it's a one-way street for the average Ukrainian.
I don't even think that that is what the European Union wants out of the Ukraine. The European Union has plenty of cheap, unskilled, uneducated labor flooding its markets and countries, which are bringing nationalist backlash in Europe and other countries. And the Ukraine doesn't present that big of a market for its goods. As John mentioned earlier, the only reason that the European Union is interested in this deal with the Ukraine is not because of integrating Ukraine. It's not because of out of concern for the Ukrainian people or any shared values, which are vastly different between the two. But it's about denying Russia a geopolitical peace that would see Russia's customs union and Eurasian Union.
All right, folks, I have to
future.
jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LeBeau. To remind you, we're discussing the fate of Ukraine. Okay, John, I'd like to go back to you in Paris. I looked at the media campaign for signing this agreement with the European Union, and it gave a choice of civilizations, which I thought was quite curious because in eastern Ukraine, it's predominantly ethnic Russians. And so what kind of message is that sending to them? Because I've been to eastern Ukraine a number of times. A lot of them don't even like the fact that they're in Ukraine, number one, and they don't like any kind of discriminatory barriers for them to go to Russia, to be with their families, to have their businesses, et cetera, et cetera. I just thought it was quite curious that it would be spun as a civilizations, as one's better than the other. Go ahead, John.
Well, that is absolutely the way the European Union sees things. I don't think we should ever underestimate the extent to which, and I had occasion only recently to confirm this through personal experience, the extent to which pro-European people in the European Union think of themselves as civilizationally superior and more advanced to everyone else. I only the other week heard a group of experts and diplomats talking about how European integration was the most sophisticated political construction in the history of humanity. These people are like the early Bolsheviks. They genuinely believe that they are in the vanguard of history, and that anybody who is against them or not with them is somehow a barbarian or a reactionary or whatever. Snobbery is alive and well in the chancelleries of Europe, I can assure you. And precisely, of course, the main civilizational rival that the European Union sees is with Russia. Russia is seen as authoritarian, corrupt, backward, reactionary, nationalistic, homophobic. All the sort of sins that can be committed in postmodern Europe are committed in Russia, and that's why, indeed, they have placed this issue of signing the agreement in these rather ridiculous Manichaean civilizational terms, which, as you know very well, Peter, don't correspond to any reality at all in terms of the differences between Europe and Russia.
Lilith, you know, one of the interesting things is that a lot of aspersions have been cast against Russia and all this and President Putin. But the Russian side said, why can't we have a trilateral agreement on this, or sit down the three parties here? And, you know, because politics is the art of the possible, and Brussels turns around and says, no, we don't do it that way. We do it our way. I mean, that seems to be a very stubborn view, and they got nothing, at least right now, and it's left all three parties up in the air. Why can't the three parties sit down? Even if it is not part of their usual procedure, they could actually iron something out where everyone wins, because Ukraine is in a lose-lose situation right now.
Well, I think this question has been discussed quite in detail in media, and the conclusion is that the provisions for a customs union and free trade agreement with EU of individual countries are in conflict. And this has been the main argument. Now, if we look at this as geopolitical issues, John has been suggesting, then surely some of these disagreements could have been ironed out. However, I would strongly dispute the argument that this has been a geopolitical game from EU's side. In fact, I see sort of a problem in logic of John's argument. If it is really a geopolitical issue on EU's behalf that allegedly believes that they are superior than Russia, Ukraine, then surely in that case the interests come to realpolitik, and that's how we should approach the issue. In that case, EU could have done much more and could have been much more flexible to claw in Ukraine from Russia. However, they have been quite insistent that, for example, Tymoshenko issue should not be dropped. And eventually, EU's statement was the following: if you prefer the European way of living, the European standards, then we're more than happy to have this association agreement signed. If you believe that your interest lies elsewhere, then it's fine as well. And I have to add that in diplomatic terms, this is just a setback in EU-Ukraine relations. It doesn't mean that the parties are gone forever. And when the conditions are right and when the parties are ready, I'm sure that these talks will renew again.
Okay, Mark, what do you think about that? Because, again, you know, Western media will say it's Russia trying to keep its hands on Ukraine. But if this kind of relationship is going to work out, Russia's going to have to pay a lot of money and invest and other kinds of reforms on Russia's side as well. Who gives away money and resources for nothing these days? No one does.
Well, certainly not the EU, because they don't have any money and resources to give away. I'd like to draw a little bit of exception to a little bit of what both of our guests said earlier. John Laughlin said that this agreement is political, and he said it was entirely political, and it certainly is demand political reforms. And our other guest, Lilith, said that in the long term that these reforms will be good for the Ukraine, although she noted that in the short to medium term they will prove, very harmful and disastrous to many of the Ukrainian people. Now, we shouldn't mistake these reforms that are demanded by both the EU and the IMF. This is a radical series of neoliberal shock therapy reforms that will drastically cut the budget, raise domestic utility prices on energy by 40%, reduce pensions, it will reduce benefits, it will devaluate the hryvnia. This will have a huge economic effect, and that is not even counting the bad effect that this will automatically have, abrogating the existing Russian-Ukrainian free trade area. And Russia is the Ukraine's biggest trade partner. The volume of Russian trade is greater with the Ukraine than that of the entire European Union as of last year. And when you combine Belarus and the Ukraine in it, that is 60% of Ukrainian trade that they would effectively be losing. This is a recipe for, as was said earlier, economic suicide. And this reiteration of the Washington consensus would be absolutely disastrous for the Ukraine, not just in the short and medium term, but as we can see the results in Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, in the long term as well.
John, speak to what's from the Orange Revolution and its failure to the present. Again, you know, I started out by saying a country divided, Ukraine is divided. And I don't see, and this is my personal opinion, the EU recognizing that, because it's very different places. If you go to Western Ukraine, I mean, all the negative things that the European Union said, the things that they're against, homophobia, Russophobia, anti-Semitism is rife in Western Ukraine, but no one likes to talk about that, you know, because they're on the quote-unquote the right side of history.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. It's absolutely incredible. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. Back in 2004, at the time of the Orange Revolution, I myself met Yushchenko demonstrators who were clearly Nazis. They were clearly neo-Nazis. And when I wrote about this, I was ridiculed. But I'm afraid it's true. I'm sure you're right. I don't know Western Ukraine particularly well. I really only know Kiev and a little bit of the south of the country. But I don't have any difficulty believing what you say. But that's the point, that while the European Union is a deeply ideological organization, while it is determined to impose, for example, gay marriage and gay rights, that gay rights, by the way, are one of the elements in this agreement, and that I think was probably a contributory factor, although not a decisive one. It wants to impose all these things, but above all, and this is where I think we do need to keep the geopolitical aspect in mind, it is prepared to look the other way, providing that its friends do what it says. On Yulia Tymoshenko, it is absolutely incredible that the European Union should demand her release. She is, of course, imprisoned on corruption charges, when one of the major European states itself has only this week decided to imprison a former prime minister on corruption charges. I'm thinking, of course, of Silvio Berlusconi. So, I mean, the double standards are absolutely breathtaking.
Let's turn everything upside down. Let's look at Kiev looking at Brussels and looking at Moscow. They don't have any agreement with either right now. If you're a good politician, and I don't know if Yanukovych is, if you're a good politician, you get the best deal from both. What do you say to that?
Well, again, I think we're sort of complicating the situation and giving it a geopolitical and slightly sinister context. Really, on the table, Ukraine had two different offers. They've tried to go with EU, considering the benefits, but at the same time, I think the Yanukovych's government was trying to probe and see whether the European Union would be able to provide some financial assistance, and also whether it would be willing to nudge the IMF to be more lenient and maybe have softer preconditions for unlocking the loan. However, the European Union made it very clear that they're not going to make any concessions, once again proving that this has nothing to do with geopolitics. If they really wanted to get Ukraine under their realm, so to speak, they would have been more flexible. They insisted that this is quite simple. It's an association agreement that has been offered not only to Ukraine but to other countries of Eastern Partnership as well, and it didn't really fit at this moment with Ukrainian interests. At the same time, I think the Ukrainian government was also trying to use the EU negotiations as leverage on Russia to see if it would be possible to renegotiate the 2009 gas agreement. This is not just about tariffs. This is about the mandatory intake of Russian natural gas and the transit volumes. Also, at the same time, trying to roll over some of the Russian debt, which they successfully did.
Okay, we're almost out of time here. We're almost out of time here. Mark, I want to give you the last word on the program. Is this all about Yanukovych and the presidential election?
It certainly plays a factor. Yanukovych has to consider his own political future and the interests of his constituency in the south and the east of the country. But I'd like to bring it to a close on the point that in the Western media, this has often been contrasted as Russia bullying the Ukraine and forcing them to do away with this association agreement. And there's no doubt that Russia has deployed economic and political carrots and
Mark,
sticks.
I wish we had more time. I wish you could finish your point. We've run out of time. I want to thank today to my guests in London, Paris, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.